All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to How New England Collaborates on Farm to School Policy Towards 30 by 30. This is a Community Powers the Food System webinar in our series. I'm Dana Stevens. I'm the project director here at FINE, Farm to Institution New England, for those of you that don't know our acronym yet. And I'm joined by my colleague, Britt Florio, our program manager, who is helping to coordinate this whole series and offering us excellent tech support and chat management today. We're so glad you're joining us, and we'd love for you to take a minute to introduce yourselves in the chat. If you'd like to share your name and your work or community affiliation. And since the theme of our webinar today is really about collaboration, if you want to share a few words or thoughts about what collaboration means to you in your work, you're welcome to do that as well. So our webinar today is about some really incredible farm to school policy developments that have taken place over the last 6 or so years in New England. And the story of how these policies are moving us toward our goals of a more just and equitable food system here, and one that can possibly produce 30% of its food by 2030. And we're just really pleased to be joined by several champions of this policy work today that will be sharing some of this story with us. So our plan for today is to just do a quick introduction about Farm to Institution New England. I'll introduce our speakers. We will set the stage for how this work has been happening and why it's important. And then we'll sort of transition into a panel discussion with our speakers. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, and we're going until 2:15 today. So if you can stay until the end, we'd love to hear your questions, and you can either drop those in the chat as we go through, or you can hold on to them and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end. Before you leave us today, we hope you'll take a minute to answer one brief survey question, which will help us understand what you're taking away from this webinar and how we can continue to offer useful programming going forward. And if you can't stay until the very end, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar afterwards. So Farm to Institution New England, if you're not familiar with us, is a network support organization we formed over a decade ago to support cross-sector farm to institution efforts in service of a better regional food system, really recognizing that institutions, schools, colleges, hospitals, corrections facilities, early childhood centers hold substantial power and wield significant influence in our food system. And so they have to be part of the solution to creating this just and equitable world we all want to live in. And so here at FINE, we host events and facilitate learning communities and conduct collaborative research and generally work to support and highlight and share the great work that's happening across the region in this space. And we have just completed a strategic plan, which we'll be releasing soon and are very excited about. And some of the language that you see here on this slide is from this brand new plan. So keep an eye out on our newsletter for that. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you can do that easily on our website. So one of the important things we do as a network support organization is to provide opportunities for people to come together, to learn and share and collaborate. And the sort of most visible way we do that is through our biennial Northeast Farm to Institution Summit. The last one took place in April 2023 in Rhode Island, and we're in the planning process for the next one in 2025, and hopefully we'll have some dates and location to share in the next few weeks. And so this webinar series was developed in part to continue the energy and momentum created at the summit and sort of lead into the next one. And we are also carrying forward the 2023 summit theme, which is Community Powers the Food System. We have hosted 4 webinars as a part of this series, highlighting the regional work that was shared or launched or inspired at the summit. And you can find all of those on our website or by following this link on the screen. And this one today, this webinar is the last in our spring series, but you can look forward to a fall webinar series as well. So now I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. We're joined by Betsy Rosenbluth, who is the Farm to School Director at Shelburne Farms and the co-director of Vermont Feed, a nationally recognized farm to school partnership program of the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont and Shelburne Farms. And Betsy also coordinates the Northeast Farm to School Collaborative, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about as we get into the policy story. And we are also joined by Renee Page, the Executive Director for Healthy Communities of the Capital Area, which is a local public health organization that serves Kennebec County, Maine. And HCCA hosts chronic disease prevention and access to local food projects, as well as several tobacco use and substance misuse prevention initiatives. And HCCA is also the fiscal and staffing home for the Maine Farm and Seed to Institution Network. And we are also pleased to have with us today Dawn Crayco, the Northeast Regional Policy Director at Food Corps. And Food Corps' vision is for every child to experience the joy and power of food in school. Dawn has experience working in the food and education systems at the grassroots and grass tops levels and strengthening programs and policies that increase access to nutritious foods and food security for children. She holds a master's in public health nutrition and is currently co-chair of the Connecticut Farm to School Collaborative and on the board of directors for End Hunger Connecticut. So a lot of wisdom and experience here today to share with you. I'm now going to pass the mic to Betsy, who is going to provide some context for this policy work that has been happening in the region, why it's important, and that will sort of help us set the stage for our panel discussion.
Great, thanks, Dana.
Yeah.
And good afternoon or morning, everyone. I thought we would start by just talking about what is farm to school, especially in the Northeast. And when we talk about farm to school, we are talking about purchasing local food, but we're also making sure kids have nourishing food and enough food. They know where it comes from, what it does for their bodies and their communities, making sure they know how to grow it and cook it, and making sure they understand what it takes to transport food or what happens to waste and how the food on their plate is tied to climate and poverty and land and water and all these global issues. So I think sometimes we think about farm to school, and Renee, we've talked about, like, you know, not long ago, it was a transactional purchase of local food, but it's really changing our culture and the way we relate to food and changing our food system. And I think most important with students, it's helping them see what their own place is in that system and how they can create change. And the next slide shows that for the Northeast, and I know nationally, lots of people have sort of adopted this 3C model of change that connects classrooms, cafeterias, and community. And that's the foundation of our work that we're working towards, that creates that change. And the next slide is just about the Northeast Farm to School Collaborative. So we began back under the umbrella of National Farm to School Network in 2008. And we have continued most recently with the generous support of a regional funder, the Henry P. Kendall Foundation. And we're comprised of farm to school statewide leaders in the 7 Northeast states, plus USDA, Fine, and Food Corps. And Shelburne Farms serves as the coordinator. And we have a long history of collaboration and successful partnerships, and often a collective 7-state voice with policy positions and regional partner coalitions, including spinning off Fine out of this group and newly creating the New England Farm to Early Childhood Coalition. And we have lots of collaborative projects. So sometimes it's developing resources like Seed to School that we can share, or shared metrics, or right now we're looking at Harvest of the Month and how do we better center equity within those materials. And the next slide just shows on our website, northeastfarmtoschool.org, we have a collection of videos for making the case for farm to school. And, you know, New England is not that big. So it's easy to be able to use each other's stories and share those materials and still relate to them. So we all have our local context and adapt it, but there's a lot of shared messaging that's worked really well. And the next slide highlights the Northeast Farm to School Institute. So we have a shared professional learning program, and it's a model program to build robust farm to school and early childhood programs that have staying power, that works on whole school change. And we've had about 120 Northeast schools participating. And we know we would reach more students supporting institutes in each of the 7 states. And this year, 2024, 6 out of the 7 Northeast states are offering a farm to school institute of their own. And I'm talking about the institute because it's a bit of a model for a collective approach to scaling up that we then wanted to apply to policy. How do we support each other? How do we scale up some of what we're learning and best practices in policy? So in New England, and there's some folks on the call that can speak more to the details of this, but we have a goal of 30% local food by 2030, 30 by 30. And we have various state level food system plans and other goals. And I just want to make the point that farm to school is so foundational to reaching our goals. Like, imagine if every child in New England grew up understanding where their food comes from and that there was equitable access to local food. You know, youth are, I hate to categorize them as our future consumers, but they are in our food system, as well as future policymakers. And we want them to have a connection to our local food system and to agriculture. And so that education is so important, and it makes all the difference. You know, you could serve local food if the students have no connection. We all know, you know, does it really come on their plate, and does it really make it into their bellies? And so that education piece is so key. So our question was, how can policy advance our goals? So how can we build demand through policy? How are we going to get to 30 by 30? And then how can policy sustain farm to school in our states over the long haul, not just for the period of a single grant? And we think part of it is this, what we've called as a sort of a shared vision of farm fresh school meals for all. And this is a graphic, if you can see it, we call the virtuous cycle, that with universal school meals, That's, free breakfast and lunch for students, for all students, packed with locally grown foods that students have had some hands-on experience with. It increases students' willingness and participation in the school meal programs, which bolster school meal revenues, which allows schools to draw down more funding and purchase even more local food. And this cycle continues. And these three components work together. It's about food access and equity, food education, and demand for local food. And the three components are the Farm to School Grants Program, which is now including early childhood in many states, a local food incentive that will reimburse schools if they purchase local food, and universal breakfast and lunch. And I would just note that prior to the pandemic, we have to update this data, 64% of the Vermont schools that were providing universal school meals had increased their local food purchasing as a result. So that was really encouraging. And I think just a little plug with universal school meals, it's so important that no student learns what hunger feels like in schools, and that every student has access to the same things, whether it's Chromebooks or textbooks or soccer balls. It should include a nutritious breakfast and lunch. And then the next slide just shows over the last, four or 5 years, we've really created this shared campaign to help each other pass our state policy and to help each other with advocacy strategies, sharing messages and materials. And it's all adapted to work in our states, but we're not reinventing each time. And we collectively, as a Northeast collaborative, hired a policy advocacy firm, Action Circles, which is based in Vermont, who's provided support and training across the Northeast. And then we use our peer learning community to understand what are some of the pitfalls and lessons learned, what's working or not, and why, and what should we consider. So we're leapfrogging some of that learning thanks to the states who went first, and we get to learn, and then we each learn from each other. So we've really come a long way. You can see on the chart, I know Rhode Island doesn't have as many checks, but they're really looking at a purchasing incentive or a local food incentive. We have right now calls to action in some of the states like New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So we're actively looking to put these pieces together across the region.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I think that's so helpful to just illuminate some of the landscape that has led to this work being possible, including that regional model and vision of 30 by 30, adopting that holistic farm to school policy virtuous cycle platform that really links together universal meal access and education and funding, and the collaborative culture that has been created where the states here can be learning from each other and pooling resources, like you mentioned, for hiring the guidance of Action Circles to really help get those policy campaigns off the ground in an effective way. So I'd like to now invite our other panelists, Dawn and Renee, into our discussion, and we're going to dive a little deeper into what some of these policy efforts look like at the state level. And we'll continue that thread of how the regional Northeast Farm to School Collaborative has helped to support and fuel those efforts. So our first question really revolves around the collaboration, and what does that actually look like at a regional level and within a state. And so Renee, I'm hoping I can start with you, and you can share a little bit about what policy collaboration looks like in Maine and how that has evolved over time.
Sure. So thank you, Dana, and thank you, Betsy, for such a great framing to kick us off. It was great to just reflect on how far we've come in a very short amount of time, I think. So in Maine, we have a lot of collaborations throughout the state, and then of course we're involved in these regional collaborations as well. So where it kind of all begins for us is with the Maine Farm and Seed to Institution Network. And as an aside, that's a recent melding of the Maine Farm and Seed to School Network and Maine Farm to Institution. We too just underwent some strategic planning and are finding some efficiencies by leaning into one network. But the network itself focuses a lot on farm to school and really serves to convene and inform various institutional food system stakeholders, to really move toward increasing demand for local food while also learning from other food buying institutions. So we've found that there's a lot to learn among hospitals and correctional facilities and schools to kind of move the 30 by 30 vision forward. So from the Maine Farm and Seed Institution Network, we've spun off a couple of working groups. We have the Maine Food Policy Work Group, which is co-convened with CEI, and that involves diverse partners working to improve Maine's food system. So we aren't just focused on farm to school policy initiatives, but a variety of local food system initiatives that move the farm to school work forward. Another group is the Maine Food Processing Work Group. That group is mostly focused on how do we take whole, fresh food and minimally process it into products that are more appealing to institutional food buyers. And I will say, as an example, out of that Maine Food Policy Work Group came so during COVID, a couple of years ago, our state had agriculture infrastructure grants that were available through the state. And we used that group to help each other, the various applicants, apply for that money that came out of a policy initiative at the state. We also, so if I shift from our state level collaborations, of which that was just a couple of examples, there's of course the Northeast Farm to School Collaborative that Betsy described. And we really, I think all of the partners in that collaborative would agree that, we're a cohort of regional partners sharing best practices and lessons learned with each other to, like Betsy said, minimize the struggle and the pain from lessons learned, but also sharing wins and successes along the way. So for example, it's not, if we are in a meeting, we talk about a certain bill and how a particular state is approaching it. It might be 6 months down the line, but I'll remember, like, oh yeah, New Hampshire tried to include that language in their bill, and I'll reach out and connect. So that, along with the Northeast Local Foods Purchasing Incentive Community of Practice, which is another group that kind of spun off from the collaborative that's specifically focused on local food purchasing incentives, is again another group of people sharing lessons learned to move forward with recommendations. And for us, it's really about identifying those key partners and leveraging those relationships. So for example, we have a couple of philanthropic committed funders in the Northeast. Betsy mentioned the Kendall Foundation, there's a Sewell Foundation, and the way we can sometimes leverage those relationships is like leveraging, say, funding from a philanthropy to apply for a federal grant that can then move our work forward. There are a number of organizations, state agencies. I actually have a little cheat list here, and I hate naming names because, feel like I'm accepting my Academy Award and I'm going to forget someone, but there's no doubt that the state agencies, whether it's Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, our universities, they are all key in leveraging how we can advance this work. And also just to keep in mind that, each organization has limitations, whether it's staff time or what they're allowed to do when it comes to lobbying and advocacy. So we really lean into those relationships to figure out who it makes sense to move things forward. And at the end of the day, what I've found, being in this space for about 15 years now, is that it's allowed us to foster relationships and build trust among each other. And it allows us to be much more nimble. So when an idea comes, comes to light, it's easy to call someone up in another state or at another organization and put heads together and ideas to move the work forward. So I can leave it there, Dana, and let someone else weigh in. But thanks.
Renee. Thanks. Yeah, I think that last point is really important to remember when we're talking about collaborations. It really comes down to what is a collaboration? It's a number of individual relationships between people, and bringing it back down to that human level can be really helpful. Dawn, I know, Connecticut has a similarly long history of collaboration in the farm to school space, and I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what this looks like in Connecticut.
I can. Thanks, Dana. And thank you, Renee and Betsy. I want to double and triple stamp so much of what you've shared. So folks with us today might hear some repetition, but that's not a bad thing. Collaboration is all over in our states and throughout the region. And for Connecticut, I think it's fair to say our work in Connecticut policy really started about 10 years ago with the investment in the start of the Connecticut Farm to School Collaborative with support from UConn Extension, the Kendall Foundation, again mentioned, and capacity through staffing at Food Corps. At that point, I would categorize ourselves as very much babies in the farm to school policy world, really learning from our peers in other states. And while we've grown up a bit, as evidenced by some of these tables, I think we still have a huge appetite for more and continue to be influenced by neighboring states, and are always learning how to improve, how to continue the support for these programs. So this slide here shows the programs and initiatives that we have now in Connecticut or are working towards, along with the in-state and out-of-state, some out-of-state partnerships that have really made them possible. In a small state such as Connecticut with 169 distinct towns and local governments, you don't get very far without collaboration. It's pretty critical to making anything happen, and especially when it comes to policy and passing bills. Implementation of the policy is also a big part of this work as well. And as our partners have underscored, this is where state agency relationships really matter. And I think it's where you learn what's working and what's not, so that you can go back to the legislature, show the impact, but also continue to work to strengthen the policy and make it more accessible and more equitable in service to kids throughout the state. So we do have a grants program here in Connecticut. We also have a new state local food incentive program, which is exciting. It just rolled out last week, I believe. So it's very, very fresh. And we're trying to promote it as much as possible right now and think about what support through implementation looks like with our partners. And then we are on the journey of hopefully sometime soon securing school meals for all in the state. We had universal no cost breakfast for students this year. And as of just last week, I believe we'll have actually moved to eliminating the reduced price category for next year. So students that are eligible for reduced price meals will be able to access no cost breakfast and lunch. That's a ... It feels like the appropriate symbol for that work. And I know from my colleagues here, it takes a while, right? And we're only 2 years at it, so we continue to learn. With respect to how our regional mentors and the Northeast Farm School Collaborative have shaped our work, I really appreciate concrete examples of what this looks like. And I appreciated the prep for this webinar and creating a space for me to reflect on like all of the ways in which states have influenced our work and helped move it along over the years. So I'm just going to call out a few examples here, but for our grant program, so the Connecticut Grown for Connecticut Kids program, I remember probably emailing you, Betsy, and saying, where's your concept language for your successful grant program? I need to copy it because we got to get to work on this and we need a starting place, right? Not even knowing like where should we start, having never been in the driver's seat of drafting, like the very start of what a program could look like and what a bill could look like. And it wasn't as simple as a copy and paste, but it was really helpful, and using a model program to then apply like, place-based concepts to what it could look like for our state around the table with a bunch of other Connecticut folks. Say, oh, that won't really work here. This might work here. We need to call it this, right? Not that. For the incentive program, we use the National Farm to School Network Local Food Incentive Program research. I think it's called the Statewide Farm to School Procurement Incentives Design, Thinking, and Analysis of the National Policy Landscape. I think I've referred to it as a blueprint. That's how we used it as a tool. We looked at the 8 categories of how you can structure an incentive program based on the 18 or 19 across the country, last I checked, and sat down and really considered what would work for us, and specifically kind of honing in on Maine's, since I believe Renee and Maine partners, you have the first incentive program on the books. So we're like, oh, well, what works about that? What's not working? How has it evolved over time? Which really helped us think about our program. And then our inspiration for School Meals for All continues to be from Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts, who have passed these landmark legislative bills that are reaching all kids in the state. And I know the coalition that's led by Enneagram Connecticut here in the state and supported by our Farm to School Network really got in the weeds with data specifically, and looking at Hunger Free Vermont and that coalition's like spreadsheets, like borrowed spreadsheets to do calculations of how much would this cost our state if we did it this way. How much would it cost our state if we considered a different way of accessing more, serving more kids? And I know there's also a lot of efforts around student, youth, and voice too that informed how we really engaged youth in our advocacy efforts. So this didn't happen, this happened over time through continuous presence at Northeast Farm to School Collaborative meetings, like little tidbits you pick up along the way. And to Renee's point, just like, oh, there was that one time someone said something, we exchanged, like a word over Zoom. Like I can now reach out and ask for more and have like a separate conversation and dig into the weeds. And it's just been a real support to us here.
Thanks, Dawn. Those were some really nice specific examples of what that information sharing looks like that has come through the collaborative. Betsy, I know you shared a little bit about the types of collaboration happening in Vermont, but I'm wondering what else you would add here.
Yeah, I might just say a few things. I mean, the main drivers on our policy, so our policies through the Vermont Farm to School and Early Childhood Network, and the main drivers were Hunger Free Vermont and SNA Vermont, the School Nutrition Association, Vermont Feed Partner, Shelburne Farms, and NOFA Vermont. But we had lots of other organizations, and I just, a few ideas to maybe just think more broadly. The union, the NEA joined, the Food Bank, the Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance, and lots of other partners. We had an organizational sign-on letter, and that was helpful. But I would say just two things. So one is we developed together as a coalition a shared vision that we're working towards, and we committed to work together towards the full vision. So we shared leadership on different steps and priorities along the way, and different organizations might take the lead on some of the bills, but no one organization was going to succeed on its own. So it really, really helped to have this shared agenda. And the shared campaign kept advocates from competing for dollars with each other or letting legislators choose one issue over another. So we got asked sometimes, this or that, and be like, what's needed is this whole, the vision. And so it really strengthened each of our individual interests through this collective approach. And the results on the next slide is when I started 10 years ago, we had $56,000 for a statewide farm to school grants program. And the last 2 years, it's been $1 million, and it's expanded to early childhood. It's included the local food incentive. And it's really, the success is this grassroots campaign and the consensus we've built around what are we asking and for what purpose? And that it was really the network presence in the legislature, right? So we all had these shared talking points, but different faces, different people were testifying. And we worked closely. I just want to highlight the state agencies. So, when issues would surface, we would offline work with them to see if we could resolve it. And so with universal meals, there was a real concern around capacity in our agency of education. And we were able to reach some agreement and include a position in the bill for the agency of education, something they could not advocate for, but we could. And that's made a huge difference for implementing the program. And with our local food incentive, the Agency of Agriculture contracts with NOFA Vermont to provide technical assistance to our school nutrition directors to help qualify them for the LFI grants. And so there's a really good working relationship that's really important, a lot of good listening and a lot of trying to work out. So we're not sitting in committee opposing each other. And I think even just regionally, like at one point in the legislative committee, we suggested they have some Maine legislators testify on, their why they passed universal meals, and it was super helpful. And we had American Farmland Trust in New York testify about their local food incentive. And it gave the committee confidence that they weren't taking all the risk going first, but they could learn from what other states' experience has been.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I think Vermont is such a great example of taking the time at the beginning to really coalesce around a long-term vision that works for everyone, and that can often feel like it's slowing the process down, but it's so clear from what you've shared that has really paved the way for this work to happen and for everyone to belong to that vision, and that vision to belong to everyone. Thanks for sharing. So our next question is really coming out of this idea that, many of us doing any type of collaborative work spend a lot of time thinking about who is part of the collaboration and who is not, and how to structure these collaboratives to be most inclusive and welcoming, and how to make sure that these efforts are designed by and creating equitable and lasting solutions that benefit those most impacted by these food system inequities. And so, Dawn, I'm going to turn to you to start us off on this part of the conversation, to talk a little bit about how equity shows up in your policy work, and what strategies you've used to center the voices of those most impacted by these food system inequities, and some of the lessons you've learned along the way.
Sure. Thanks, Dana. So there's three kind of buckets I think I would name when it comes to how equity shows up in our policy work. One would be messaging, partnerships, and the actual crafting of the policy itself. So around messaging, we believe School Meals for All is a justice issue. It's about reimagining the system for kids, all kids, not just those that meet certain income guidelines. And it's been about bringing others along and seeing and taking action around the idea that nourishing, local, fresh, no-cost meals is a right and an imperative for the benefit of our youth. And as as it relates to their educational experience and helps them to grow and thrive. So we've been seeking out partnerships who share these values, and we want every child in every school to experience the joy and power of food in school. And our Connecticut Farm to School Collaborative has a vision that mirrors that as well. And to do that, we have to be looking hard at inequities in the systems and specifically where communities that have been marginalized and the systems that are not working for folks, and rebuild by writing policies that help build new systems. This slide is out of place, Dana, but I wanted to show it. No, it's not on you, that's on me. But I was like, I don't know where it fits, but I want to put it out there because it's an example of how youth is centered in the School Meals for All work. So if you can read, it's a little blurry, a little hard to read because of the faint pencil. But it is an example of how youth were centered and continue to be in the School Meals for All effort in Connecticut. For partnerships, it's like you said in the beginning, Dana, it's about who's really in the room and asking ourselves who isn't, who's shaping the advocacy effort and the policy. And it's looked like leaning into growing our network and relationship building opportunities while we're also doing the policy making. It's not like one or the other, that we want to take advantage of timely opportunities to, there is no time to waste to work on these issues. So it's about getting to work and always asking ourselves who's informing the work, who's driving the work, whose voice is being centered. So what this has looked like for us is in our collaborative, which is a group of over 300 individuals. They're invited to every bi-weekly policy strategy meeting we have. We don't have a separate policy working group. We did at some point, and we're like, wait, does this really make sense? Like, it really should be the entire network that's invited to every meeting, and people should feel like they can enter into that space, not know what's going on, and we should be able to hold the space that makes people feel welcome and that they can share their idea, their critique, push us to think about things differently, or just like find a way to engage, that particular week, because that's when they have the capacity. And that's where a lot of relationships, I think, have really developed and helped deepen the strength of our network. It's also about who's centered in the advocacy activity, like kids here. But when possible, it should be those most impacted in ways that support them to see and utilize their power and share their story. And oftentimes, I know for me personally, it's been taking a seat back or a back seat to the metaphorical podium or the actual podium, and just identifying folks who may have something to share and figuring out if there's if it's a new experience for them, what kind of support might they need to do that? Is a template testimony? Is it meeting them at the Capitol and walking in with them to the room and explaining like what is about to happen, right? Is it sitting by their side? And over time, that like support at a very basic level, I think, can really help folks' confidence and like appetite grow. I just think it's a beautiful thing to experience. I'm probably stretching my time, but I do want to give one very specific policy example of where I think we kept asking ourselves, how can equity be centered in the construction of a new initiative or program, which would be the Connecticut Local Food for Schools program. So one of our very first things after culling through the National Farm to School Network's large research and report was to convene a focus group of school nutrition directors to really inform what the structure should look like for our state-based incentive. At the same time, just to echo what Betsy had said, I was meeting with the state agency, our Department of Education and Agriculture, and asking them, what are their thoughts? What are their limitations? What's what would their wish list be if they were going to start this from scratch or build off of the federal program. And some of the main decisions that came out of that were number one, universal eligibility for participation. So every district in the state getting a set amount of funding out of the larger pot versus having to apply for a competitive grant or reach a certain percentage of local in order to participate. It also resulted in naming a prioritization for BIPOC growers in purchasing efforts and the technical assistance that's needed to support directors in starting relationships if they don't already have them. And ensuring the incentive could be used for all meal programs as well. So knowing that, you know, summer's almost upon us. Summer is when a lot of students don't have access to 2 or sometimes 3 meals a day, but there are summer meal programs that are running. So how can this program also work within summer meal programs so that there's extra, and, you know, pairs really well with the growing season, right? This is like when local food is abundant. So those were 3 ways in which I feel like we centered equity, we sought input, and we kind of baked it into the design of the program.
Thanks, Dawn. Renee and then Betsy, I'd love to hear from you both before we move on to our next question.
Sure. So that was a lovely story, Dawn, and I just love that postcard edition. That's super. Great example for sure. So the way I decided to tackle this question was really around the iterative process that we've taken in Maine around, in particular, our local food purchasing incentive. So yes, Dawn, I do believe we were the first in the nation to pass this legislation back in 2006, though I challenge, you know, open to any argument on that if there is another state who was ahead of us. I always like to point out that the Maine state motto is Dirigo, which means I lead. So we like to think we're leading on this one. And what's worth pointing out about our original local produce fund was it was established to provide a $1 reimbursement for every $3 spent on local food. And that local food had to be farm direct, produce only. So the idea is that it really centered small food producers. Like the idea wasn't like you could go to a huge industrial farm. So that's how the fund was established. And then you'll notice in 2019, we actually funded the fund. So that was a bit of a miss on the original legislation, which is probably why it's so easy to pass, because it wasn't funded. It had no fiscal note. It just established the fund. So it's kind of like we opened our bank account, but we didn't put any money into it. Our state Department of Education was creative over the years, often finding little pockets of money that they could divert to the fund and schools could access it. But it was first come, first serve. And when it's gone each year. And some years there was no funding available at all. So in 2019, this was our first kind of overhaul of this bill. And what it did was it funded the fund, essentially. So it created a position at the Department of Education to oversee it and help implement it, and also came with a technical assistance component as well. So DOE was able to offer trainings around using local food, around developing culturally appropriate menus, etc. So that was our biggest overhaul there. And then again in 2021, the local produce fund became the local food fund, which expanded the allowable foods beyond just produce. And it also opened up purchasing to be able to be done through distributors. There was a lot of discussion around that because some of us who've been around since the inception of the original bill felt very strongly that part of the what was great about Maine's legislation is that it really lifted up small producers, but we also had to recognize the challenge of school buyers to have to seek out these products, you know, one by one, farm by farm. So so we did, you know, without going into all the details, there's a lot of pieces built into the newest version of the bill to still lift up small farms, and those farms are being supported, as well as being able to access foods through a distributor. And then in not to be done with the school meals for all, back in 2021, Maine by hours became the second state to implement this legislation. I'm just picturing Governor Mills and Governor Newsom from California like running to sign these bills, because it was literally within hours, and California beat us, but that's okay. This is all for good, right? It's not a competition, Renee. So super excited to do this, because this really expanded reach for kids. And we've talked about this already today, about, you know, just all the wins that School Meals for All does. And again, just back to the iterative stepwise process that Dawn outlined, because like we've been there, like we passed school like free breakfast years ago, and then we got rid of the reduced lunch category. So it is you can't do it overnight. So this iterative process can be painful for those of us who want to change the world overnight, but it really allows for that collaborative buy-in from other sectors, like Betsy described. Like, you don't want to be sitting in a legislative committee, you know, asking to take money from, you know, another organization or another initiative that would also benefit people. So how can we work together to get more of what we are all aiming for? Another example of how this work has expanded is the Maine Marinara Collaborative. We were in Maine awarded a Henry P. Kendall Foundation Food Vision Prize to take locally sourced ingredients, primarily from immigrant farms, to develop a marinara sauce that met school nutrition guidelines. And also we brought in other food buying institutions as well to kind of leverage the buy, so we could have a bigger buying pool for this. And this has been a 2-year process that was born out of that food policy work group that I talked about earlier, and has been a great collaboration of so many partners to develop this product that is now being served in Maine schools and other institutions, and being sourced from marginalized farms. And most recently, just another way that we're supporting this work going forward is our Department of Education has leveraged some COVID relief funds to bring in some local food coordinators to help us work by superintendent region across the state, so the entire state will be supported, to figure out how we can do a better job of having schools access and utilize our local food purchasing incentive. So more to come, always evolving, and we're always learning from one another, that's for sure. Thanks, Dana.
So much.
That was great. Yeah. I would just add 2 quick things. One, to build on what Dawn said about students. So our students have been the most effective advocates in the State House, and we provide them support that they need and some training, and they've been willing to share their lived experiences. So I just want to share a quote from Emma, who was a freshman at Essex High School and super engaged in the whole campaign. Forgetting lunch money was embarrassing, but for many, embarrassment wasn't the biggest issue. Instead, it was the fear and reality of being hungry all day. And that's just one tiny piece of hours of testimony from students. And what it did is engage the legislators to start sharing their own stories and their own school lunch memories. And it really connected them personally to the issue, whether they were Republicans, Democrats, progressives in Vermont. They were all taken back to what was their experience, and hearing the students share those lived experiences really helped them become champions for these efforts. And I think the other thing I would say is just, we really needed to change the public narrative about school food. And instead of focusing on all the things wrong, we really looked at well, what would it look like if school meal debt was eliminated, or if cafeterias had the staffing and infrastructure to process locally grown foods, or sharing communal meals was a daily experience with students and staff? Like really developing this vision. And over time, it worked. And it's not me, it's our whole coalition, and changed that story, which was really important. And our emphasis on equity and collective responsibility, that every student should have access to the same things while at school, it started to silence one of the most common objections to our vision, which is, well, individual parents should be responsible for feeding their own children. But to really change that narrative was really important, and to really make sure that we all were clear about that equity and collective responsibility of making sure the most nourishing food was reaching our students.
Thank you all. It's very inspiring. And I think you've all touched on this last question a little bit as you've gone, but it's very clear that policy work, and especially collaborative, network-informed policy work, is far from straightforward. It's iterative, or it's cyclical. And so I just wanted to give each of you an opportunity to share one of your hardest earned lessons from this work, and how you're using those lessons to move forward. And also want to remind us that we would love to save some time at the end for some questions from the audience. So Betsy, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I'll try to do this in a minute. I would say two things, and this came up when we were testifying and being asked how meals can help farmers. And it's difficult to show the extent of the support from the agriculture community. We can always get a farmer or two, but we launched a farm visibility campaign, This Farm Feeds Vermont Kids, that identified now 126 farms across our state that are selling to schools or early childhood. And we place these campaign type signs on the roadside, or they would put them up at the farmers market booths, so that decision makers could see the connection to Vermont farms in their own community when they were driving through or visiting the farmers market. And so that was really helpful in addressing, like, how do we make this clear, the connection back to our farms? And the second quick thing is just, everyone knows that schools are under so much pressure these days, with high turnover of educators and school nutrition staff. And if we're asking them to do anything more, like buying local, we really need to partner around some of these labor issues and look for solutions. So I think it's an issue going forward to really be paying attention to. We had a lot of success implementing the local food for schools funding. That was USDA funding that went to schools for local food. And not just in Vermont, but in the Northeast, we have an alternative distribution network with our food hubs that were able to do that more efficiently, without as much a burden on our school nutrition staff. And so I think as we think about future policy issues, how can we address these labor issues as well in all of this? And I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Betsy. Renee, what would you add?
Yeah, those were awesome points, Betsy. Thank you for that. For us in Maine, what we've learned is that, in particular with our local food fund, if we build it, will they come, was my thought on this, because once we funded the fund, it has remained underutilized. So, we'd love to see that money being used right down to the penny every year. So we need to figure out what the ongoing challenges are for our schools in accessing and utilizing those funds. So, we've tried to tackle things like minimal processing, but Betsy, even what you just said about labor, I'm positive that's an issue. So we just need to still keep working toward it. With School Meals for All, you know, it's a great initiative, and I'm so pleased that we're going state by state to make this happen. But ultimately, we really need this happening at the federal level, because it's still cumbersome and burdensome for schools, because you know, they still need to collect, for example, the free and reduced lunch forms, because they have to seek that federal reimbursement still to match the state, offset the state dollars. So, and that's confusing for families. Like, they don't understand why they should have to do that if we have free school meals for all. So that's another one that's not wrapped up just because we've done this state by state. So going forward in the Northeast, and working toward this 30 by 30 initiative, we're thinking about a regional purchasing incentive. So each of us, almost every state has a local food purchasing incentive now, but how do we look at that more regionally? And we've seen where this can really work, especially with our states that have a lot of other state borders. And a lot of purchasing sometimes happens over state lines. So how can we look at this as a regional food system and incentivize it that way? A couple of states have tried to dip their toes in this already, but it hasn't been successful so far in a big way. I think part of it is because we've done such a great job historically convincing legislators to have our institutions buy Maine food. It's like, okay, well, forget what I said about that. Now we want to buy New England food. So, so we're having to kind of walk that back a little bit in an effort to expand what we're doing. And I think I'll just close by saying, you know, it's so important to continue to figure out how we support this collaborative work. We've been so fortunate that the Henry P. Kendall Foundation and the New England has supported this ongoing collaboration and network building, but you know, personally, I don't think it's fair that it's just one funder supporting that work. I feel like it needs to be leveraged and supported by other funding sources that see us advancing their priorities as well. So I know we're under the time crunch, Dana, so I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Renee. Dawn, let's go to
You have time for me? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief. Renee, we're one of those toe dippers here in Connecticut. So we have the regional incentive, like I said, just rolled out. So I know it's all eyes on Connecticut to see how it works, but game for that that collaboration and sharing of lessons learned. We could have a whole webinar on lessons learned and challenges. Maybe we will someday, but to sum it up here, and Dana, could you go to the next slide?
Yes.
I'm in like reflective post-mortem phase right now because our session ended last year. So, or last week, excuse me. So as I think about lessons learned and things I might have done differently, I think they can be traced back to one of these or all of these things: relationships, communication, and values alignment. So I think about something that didn't go the way we wanted it to, or a twist, and there's always going to be things you can't control because we can't control the worlds and other people, but there oftentimes I can trace it back to like, oh, did we circle back with that group, or you know, did we meet with that legislator? Did we really showcase the impact of our work in the way that was needed? So I guess I just urge folks, if this resonates for you, to like just consider these three things as you move forward in your advocacy work. I know for the aligned values piece, we borrowed this, or you know, learned from Vermont in this way. We did not have like a values conversation at the very beginning of some of our School Meals for All efforts, and you know, it's never too late. So by the time we did, I think it became helpful in just the last couple of weeks, where we had hours to get an answer back to a legislator about how this policy was going to move forward. And we got to ask ourselves, well, what's the thing that will match our vision of every child every day? And it made it really clear what the answer was in that moment. And we had that conversation with other partners before, so we felt confident in moving forward, recommending what we did with the limited amount of funding we were given. So always learning, but these are 3 buckets. And then the last thing I would just say is, I think it's a missed opportunity, or it has been, for us to not think about when the session is not convening, given we have convening since we have a part-time legislature. That's the time in which you have the opportunity to really build your advocacy engine, meet with legislators, get them to see farm to school in action, and also build your network and your skills as a coalition. So we are about to in mid-June kick off a advocacy training, which is an 8-week I'd say intensive, 3 hours a week for 8 weeks, cohort with women of voices of color around the community organizing fundamentals, and building towards a logic model and a plan for our session next year. So this is leading us to a place where hopefully it's not just a couple of people, leading the effort, and more are seeing themselves in the work, and their leadership is really on display, and they feel like they've got the skills to show up for kids and next year's session. So that's the funding to compensate people for that training is actually through the Northeast Farm to School Collaborative as well. So it's another way in which the regional efforts are fueling the state work. Okay, sorry,
Thanks
Dana.
so much, Dawn. No, that's great. I think, everyone can tell that, we've just scratched the surface here, and you've shared just a very small portion of this vast body of work and lessons learned, and experience with many, many partners over the years. And, I've been hearing little bits and pieces of this story as it has gone, and I still find it so inspiring to hear how it's come together and how it's continuing to evolve. So I think I speak for everybody here saying thank you for the work you've done to help make it happen, and also for being here and sharing some of that process with us today. So we're gonna open it up to questions, but before we do that, I know the first question will be, how do we get involved? For those folks that are in our region and not yet connected to any of these efforts. So Betsy, do you want to share a little bit of this slide?
Sure. We just did a very quick brainstorm, but I think all 7 Northeast states have a farm to school network or a policy coalition working on legislation. So even if you just want to take the smallest step, get in touch with that group and contribute. You can just share or post on social, or a letter to your very local paper. I think they still have letters to the editor in those papers, just to spread the word and share the stories of impact. Like, what difference does this make? I also think inviting your legislator to school lunch. I mean, they're making policy, and they're really probably haven't been in a cafeteria in a long time, many of them. So doing that, and just plugging into that campaign, calling your legislator and saying, or emailing or texting, this is really important. Pay attention. Are lots of ways to get involved, from the easiest, like, I'm just going to leave a message. It'll take me 3 minutes and I have a talking point, to, okay, I'm going to be part of this. I'm going to offer to testify, and I want to be part of this team. So there's a way to plug in.
And if anyone is interested in who those people are, at least for Maine, Vermont, and Connecticut, those folks are here, and any of these folks can help put you in touch with the state policy leads in other states as well. So I'll leave this up for a minute just in case folks want to take a screenshot or write anything down. So we're going to open our poll, our webinar survey, with one question now. And we're going to spend a few minutes here answering any questions. And I see one from Peter. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now so we can see each other. Hello, everyone. So Peter asks, can you give us a sense of the objections from legislators to any of the specific pieces of legislation? Certainly cost is a big issue, but are there other issues that frequently come up to not providing meals for all kids or to not incentivize local purchasing? Betsy, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I guess a couple of things that come up. I think we've mentioned, I'll just highlight. So there's some concern. So many school nutrition staff buy across state border. So what do we do about that? I think legislators, besides just parents should take care of it, they just weren't seeing they were seeing a competition between school meals or other educational priorities instead of seeing if you have a hungry kid. And really, universal meals is not a small price tag, but if you look at the entire budget we spend educating kids, it's a waste if they're hungry and they can't concentrate. And so a lot of people could understand that. And even being in the legislature, if you skip breakfast and lunch, it really interferes with your ability to do your job. So it was an issue, but I think we worked hard to take it away from being a competition. And the purchasing incentive had so much support, and the grant program, I think some of it is just a sense of urgency. And I would encourage you, like, why now? Why is this important? And to really have the people it affects, like farmers and students, speaking to it so that people understand it's not just a nice thing. Like for Farm to School, there's not a lot of opposition, but I think there's some lack of urgency sometimes to understand how important it is and how much it connects to the larger food system. So that's how we countered it.
Dawn or Renee, do you have anything to add? What have you seen?
I mean, just to piggyback on what Betsy was saying about some of the feedback, in particular on school meals for all, in addition to legislators, I mean, I would see it in like editorials from citizens about, families should feed their own kids, and, I feed my kid, I shouldn't have to feed your kid, like, just straight up saying all that. But I think we did a good job regionally, like I love just the analogy around, well, we don't charge kids for books, we don't charge kids for other sports. Now some schools do charge kids for sports, but yeah, just kind of lumping the school meal into the school day and as just part of going to school, for sure. But of course, a lot of school budgets are driven in a way where the school meal program is separate from the rest. It's like a separate entity, like that has to fundraise for itself from outside of the full school budget. So yeah, it's sad, but contentious, and happy that we did the right thing in Maine.
For Connecticut, I'd say on top of the personal responsibility challenge, we've also run into a whose job is it to pick up the cost? Is it the local? Is it the district? Or is it the state? Like if the district wants this to happen, can't the district kick in the funds? I think that's been a real sticking point for us, and what ultimately we're going to have to figure out for the future. Yeah, so it's that's come up. And then I think this isn't a direct answer to that question, but I do think that we're never really done educating lawmakers on what encompasses farm to school. And it's been challenging sometimes to explain, or you have to be really like specific and why we need a grants program, why we need an incentive, how school meals for all fuels farm to school. Like they get a little lost in that. And it can get really tricky when it comes to actually moving forward with a state statute. I could talk for a while about that, but legislators thinking, didn't we do that? Didn't we do that last session? I thought we did the farm to school thing. So we've had to been really, really intentional about how we talk about, and even our messaging and positioning of the programs in like our materials, right? Like the grants program really supports like educational efforts, experiential learning for kids. The incentive helps school nutrition directors purchase local. Here's how they complement one another. So I would just say that's one of the, just ongoing challenges of the policy work.
Yeah, that communication piece is definitely a big theme here. For sure, how to shape that narrative and share those ideas. Well, that is our time. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the webinar and spending some time with us today. And big thanks to you, Dawn and Betsy and Renee, for helping to share this story and for all the good work that you've been doing. We will share the recording after we're done here today. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and keep in touch. Thanks so much.